Good morning, and good news, everyone. I found my next book, The Missing Ministry of the Risen Christ, by good old Jonah Barnes. So, we've already got that. I pre-ordered it as soon as it became available from Plain and Precious Publishing. It arrived yesterday. It'll be a really great read, I can already tell. I barely cracked open the book. Saw some of the charts, and they are hilarious as always. I look forward to it. But right now, we are still on Carthage Conspiracy. We're on Chapter 10, To Tranquilize the Public Mind. Last time, we saw how the prosecution rested their case. There's a question about whether he did all that he could. The book basically answers that, yeah, he did do all that he could. Could he have been even more fervent? Yeah, that's possible. Yeah, we'll see. I mean, well, actually, we won't see. We just need to figure that out for ourselves. I personally think in a world where everyone was acting practically, even though he could have had more witnesses, the witnesses weren't forthcoming. He was trying to do the best that he probably could to all his practical matters, and there you go. So, do I blame Lamborn? No, not exactly, but at the same time, we'll see what happens. All right. The examination of the defense witness took a little over one court day, commencing at 9:15 on Tuesday and concluding just before lunch on Wednesday. The defense effort was predictable. All 16 defense witnesses focused on impeaching the prosecution's key witnesses, Brackenbury, Daniels, and Graham. There was no alibi evidence. None of the defendants took the stand. The first two witnesses were used to impeach the truthfulness of Brackenbury. The New Hampshire-born William Smith and Pennsylvanian James Reynolds were residents of La Harpe and in northeast part of the county. Reynolds had been the foreman, and Smith had been the member of the grand jury that had returned to the indictments of this case. In this case, both testified to the differences between what Brackenbury had said in this trial and the testimony he gave to the grand jury. Their recollection of the grand jury testimony was strengthened by reference to the memorandum of Daniels and Brackenbury's testimony that Reynolds had written and signed within a few days after the grand jury hearing in October. Browning was allowed to read this memorandum to the jury by common consent of counsel. Consistent with the written memorandum, Reynolds and Smith testified that Brackenbury had told the grand jury that Colonel Williams had been at the jail on horseback during the shooting. In this trial, Brackenbury had denied giving such testimony. This same contradiction had been presented to the May grand jury in support of the perjury charge against Brackenbury, but the grand jury, with its Mormon foreman, had refused to indict. Now the same testimony was being used to impeach Brackenbury. Reynolds and Smith also described how Brackenbury had told the grand jury that the messenger in the Carthage gray uniform had spoken with Colonel Williams and Henry Stevens. In the current trial, Brackenbury had testified that Williams was not present, but that it was Aldrich who got the message, contrary to his denial in the present trial. Brackenbury had also told the grand jurors that when Sharp rode past his wagon after the shooting, he said that the Smiths were dead, for he had hold of them. Reynolds and Smith thus identified at least 3 significant contradictions in Brackenbury's testimony to different juries. Lamborn's brief cross-examination of William Smith sought to revive Brackenbury's damaged credibility. He succeeded in having the witness concede that most of his statements, which I heard him make on yesterday, corresponded pretty generally with what he said before the grand jury. Nonetheless, the inconsistencies identified by the defense, though isolated, remained unexplained. In contrast, it is significant that neither Reynolds nor Smith testified to any contradictions between Daniels' lengthy testimony and what he told the grand jury. This was no oversight. The comparison of the memorandum of grand jury testimony with the various accounts of the trial show that Daniels' testimony was essentially the same on both occasions. The impeachment of Daniels would have to take a different form. 9 witnesses gave testimony to discredit Daniels. The first 4 contradicted his trial testimony, and the other 5 sought to discredit his integrity and truthfulness generally. 3 young farmers who lived south of Carthage, Larkin Scott, Derek Fuller, and John Pike, all described the same events. Fuller and Pike were southbound on the Quincy Road just outside Carthage when they heard gunfire. Daniels overtook and joined them about a mile farther on and told them the Smiths had been killed. Near dark, the trio stopped at Larkin Scott's farm, 8 miles south of Carthage. Here, Daniels told the 3 men that he had been with the first group of men who jumped the fence around the jail and struggled with the guards. He marveled over the strength of Worrell, who waved his sword about and had to be held down by 2 or 3 men. "I am the man who took his sword out of his hand and threw it over the fence," Daniels told them. Fuller and Pike testified Daniels had asked them if we saw Worrell before he did to tell him where his sword was. All of this, of course, flatly contradicted Daniels' statement during cross-examination, where he denied telling these men that had helped in the struggle with the guards at the jail. Scott quoted Daniels as saying that it did not affect him to see the Smiths killed, as they richly deserved it. Now, you can impeach a witness on being Mormon, but trying to impeach these counter-witnesses for they richly deserved it. Yeah, let's see what Lamborn does. As this trio of witnesses quoted Daniels in supposed additional contradictions, they got into some minor contradictions of their own. Fuller said Daniels told them that Smith was set up against the well curb. Scott and Pike did not hear him say this. Scott and Fuller and Daniels mentioned nothing about any marvelous light, but on Lamborn's cross-examination, Pike remembered Daniels saying there's a flash of lightning come down then at the jailhouse at the time the murder was committed. All 3 agreed that Daniels said nothing about men being paralyzed and having to be carried away. Like so many of their fellow citizens of Hancock County, these 3 witnesses were anxious to minimize their knowledge of the crime, whether they approved it or not. They didn't want to be involved. A short series of questions which Lamborn and Larkin Scott on cross-examination illustrates the typical attitude. Question: why did you stop Daniels from telling the names of those engaged in killing the Smiths? Answer: because I didn't want to know the men that did it. Question: why did you not want to know the men that did it? Answer: because I felt I did not want to know anything more about it. Question: you stopped him before he mentioned any others? Answer: yes. Really? Really? Lamborn's cross-examination was particularly skillful, reminding the jury that none of these witnesses had identified any contradictions between Daniels' testimony and what he told them earlier on the key fact that these 5 defendants were involved in the murder. One of his questions suggested that Daniels' account of being in the struggle with the guards was just bragging to make himself appear a big man. He also secured an admission that, except for the differences noted, the balance of Daniels' statement to Fuller was about as he told it here. Browning's attempt to get direct contradiction of Daniels' testimony was duplicated evidence he had already brought out in his cross-examination of a prosecution eyewitness. Thomas Dixon, in contrast to Daniels' account, Dixon had testified that Joseph Smith did not hang in the window before he dropped. He did not see anyone take hold of Smith or raise him up. He did not see the 4 men shoot Smith after raising himself against the well curb. Finally, Dixon saw no marvelous light about his body and no one paralyzed so that he could not move. The testimony of the 4th witness in this group, John Carlyle, was hopelessly confused and meaningless, and Browning hustled him off the witness stand as soon as he could. Apparently, even a large battery of defense counsel occasionally had insufficient advance review of their witnesses' testimony. The 5 witnesses in the second group were used to attack Daniels' character and credibility generally, rather than to contradict specific details of his testimony. Charles Andrews, a carriage painter, was Daniel's brother-in-law. He told how Daniels came to his house in Quincy just after. So here's what I find interesting. So Daniels is apparently the one who put forward the fantastical testimony, the one who was kind of fuzzy on, well, why was he there in the first place? But, he saw that light, but then when the booklet was published, there was additional details by his friend that was put in about people being paralyzed, etc., which they keep harping on. But his testimony is consistent, very consistent. Isn't that interesting? You can call him somewhat of a braggart. You can call him someone who maybe exaggerates slightly, but it's consistent. I find that fascinating. Yet the person who was in the wagon and, slightly tipsy, etc., got a few details a little bit off. But the fact is that it was generally the same. Anyway, Charles Andrews, a carriage painter, was Daniel's brother-in-law. He told how Daniels came to his house in Quincy just after his July visit to the Mormons in Nauvoo and flashed around $10 in bills, which he said he had received from Emma Smith for his expenses. Later, Daniels told Andrews that Mr. Bedell of Warsaw had offered him $500 to go away, but that he intended to stay and testify, since he could get $1,000 from the state. 4 other witnesses, Coleman, Garrett, Thomas L. English, George Siebold, and George McLean, all testified to a more discrediting story. 3 of these men were Coopers, like Daniel. I think Coopers mean like copper rights, I suspect. They used it a lot. I didn't question it. I figured I knew what it was, but just wanted to check. What is the meaning of the word Cooper? Will you work? What is the meaning of the word Cooper? Craftsman who makes or repairs wooden barrels. Oh, nuts. United States industrialist building the first Americans. Yeah, okay. I was close. I got it wrong. So, Cooper, even though it sounds like copper, is actually a hooper for barrels. So, Cooper is a barrel maker. He'd worked with them in Quincy during the summer following the murder and confided in them as Brother Chips. Browning skillfully directed each witness into revealing Daniels' boasting about his part in the trial. Garrett told the jury how Daniels had bragged to him that he had quit coopering and never expected to do any more hard work. McLean quoted Daniels as saying, "There was no use in working so hard when a man could make plenty of money without working." Siebold and McLean both told the jury how Daniels had bragged that he would get $500 from a speculation which he did not specify. 3 witnesses quoted Daniels as saying that he was to be paid $500 for giving evidence against the men who were charged with killing the Smiths. According to witnesses, English and Siebold did not identify the persons who made him this offer. Daniels told Garrett that the Mormons were paying him $500 or $600 to testify. They had already gotten some of it. Daniels also told this witness that Governor Ford was going to pay him $300 in addition. Really? English testified that when he first asked for news about the Mormons, Daniels told him he knew nothing about the killing of the Smiths. McLean told the jury the same thing. Later, according to English, Daniels went to Nauvoo. When he returned in August or September, he told English he had made a great speculation in writing a book about the murders in Carthage. Browning questioned the Irishman about what he said then. "Why," says I, "you told me you knew nothing about it." "Well," says he, "as long as I can make a speculation, I will and do you say nothing about it." Daniels also told English that he had not gotten any money, but he had gotten $100 in trade, which suited him just well. English said he then told Daniels he thought he was not intelligent enough to write a book. or as another source puts it, he was not a man of any great figures, as I had tried him. Daniels replied that he had friends to aid him in it. Okay, so it sounds like what is Daniels bragging about is the fact that he made a book. When he keeps saying that he had this speculation that he could make $1,000 from it, it sounds like he figures that from writing this book he could actually get about that much from selling the book more than anything. But Lamborn's cross-examination of English was notably unsuccessful, serving only to strengthen the impression that here was a man who spoke forthrightly, honestly, and completely. A question: and you get nothing for coming here? Not a cent, sir. Who paid your expenses? No one but myself. I suppose you thought it right to kill Joe Smith? I don't think it right to kill any man. What made you so peculiar, anxious in volunteering your services and testifying? I thought I was in duty bound to do so. Lamborn's cross-examination gave McLean an opportunity to affirm that Daniels had told him he was in Augusta the night of the murder, which would place him far from the events he'd claimed to have witnessed. While the testimony of these impeaching witnesses was not entirely consistent, its overall effect was surely discrediting. Lamborn probably winced inwardly at hearing his key witness portrayed as a cheap opportunist. Not only was there evidence that Daniels had a corrupt pecuniary motive for his testimony, but Siebold and McLean had made Daniels seem a liar by contradicting his denial on direct examination. That he had told these men that he had been offered $500 to testify. The only bright spot was the admission secured on cross-examination from one witness that Daniels didn't say anything about coming here to swear anything that was not true. Daniels was apparently paid or promised some money by someone in Nauvoo for his contribution to the booklet, and some of his bragging could have doubtless been related to that arrangement. Immediately after the Carthage trial, Lyman O. Littlefield would publish a notice in Nauvoo that no one should purchase that no one should purchase the $2 the two $50 notes he had given to William M. Daniels, dated November 23, 1844, since Littlefield has not had value and also had valid counterclaims against Daniels. The total of these notes may have been the $100 in trade for his speculation that Daniels described to English. Lamborn's failure to bring about this redeeming explanation on cross-examination or by rebuttal witnesses may have resulted from insufficient preparation, or, like other defenses in this performance, may have been attributable to mental deterioration from excess drinking that was soon the cause of his death. Great. So, Lamborn could have helped save the testimony of Daniels and explain why there was this talk about this, but he didn't have preparation, and his drinking soon led to his death. Browning's impeachment effort had been effective, and the court adjourned at 4:30 p.m. on Tuesday. The defendants could feel reassured that their prospects for acquittal had been noticeably improved. In a letter apparently sent on Tuesday evening, the correspondent of the Missouri Republican gave this account to his readers. The testimony on the part of the state has been very lame, and that the witnesses so very contradictory. This is the Missouri Republican we're talking about. So very contradictory, really. And the fact that the improper influences had been brought to bear upon them, so very apparent, it is not within the bounds of probability that the jury will hesitate for one moment in honorably acquitting the prisoners. They're stuffing the jury box, although the jury should be above reading the Missouri Republican, apparently. But the writer also referred particularly to his belief that the witness Daniels, the most important on the part of the state, had been proven to have acknowledged that he was to get $500 from the Mormons and $300 from Governor Ford for testifying in the case, which, where are they getting this? Anyways. Is he braggadocious? Is that the idea? And he just is running his mouth about how he's getting money from selling his stuff, and then people are just saying, oh, well, the Mormons are going to give him $500 and Governor Ford's going to give him $300. I don't know. The last trial testimony commenced at 7 o'clock on Wednesday, May 28th. John W. Williams, an elderly Carthage farmer, began with the brief testimony that he had been in Carthage on the morning when the Smiths were killed, and that he had seen Sharp in company with Governor Ford at Hamilton's just after breakfast and before the governor's council with the militia officers. The obvious purpose of the testimony was to contradict Eliza Graham's statement that she had seen Sharp in Warsaw the same morning, but Lamborn's lengthy cross-examination ignored this testimony and struck out in a new direction in an apparent effort to elicit additional evidence helpful to the prosecution. That effort was soon aborted by Browning's objection and Judge Young's ruling that the prosecutor had to limit his cross-examination to matters in witnesses' earlier testimony. He could not use cross-examination for the purpose of making out the case. Okay. Dude, Lamborn, get on it. The last four witnesses for the defense were used to impeach Eliza Jane Graham by contradicting numerous other details of her testimony. Abraham I. Chittenden, a 64-year-old farmer who owned the land where the militia bivouacked just east of Warsaw and had two sons in the militia unit, testified Grover had eaten breakfast at his home that morning, contradicting Graham's testimony that Grover and Davis took their breakfast at Fleming's. Her testimony on that point was also countered by E.W. Gold, a Warsaw merchant boarding at Fleming's, who could not recall seeing either man at breakfast that morning. Graham had testified that Sharp had arrived at Fleming's Warsaw house in a two-horse carriage with James Gregg just before sundown on the days the Smiths were killed. Parts of the testimony were contradicted by these witnesses, but their testimony itself was somewhat inconsistent. Chittenden swore that James Gregg rode into Warsaw on horseback just before sundown alone. Gold testified that Gregg rode on into Warsaw on horseback about sundown with Sharp. Neither of these witnesses saw any two-horse carriage. Neither did Edward A. Bedell, a young Jack Mormon and prosperous Warsaw merchant, who testified that he saw Sharp ride into Warsaw on horseback alone about 20 minutes before sundown. Lamborn easily exploded this supposed inconsistency with Eliza Graham's testimony by securing concessions on cross-examination that Sharp and Gregg could have gone to Fleming's in a carriage after their arrival in Warsaw on horseback. Nonetheless, these damaging contradictions could linger in the minds of the jury. Lamborn's cross-examination secured a partial corroboration of one aspect of Graham's testimony. Chittenden admitted that when Gregg rode by him, he said, "The governor had not whipped us yet. The Smiths are dead." More important, Gold testified that when Sharp dismounted after his arrival in Warsaw, someone asked him the news. He replied, "Joe and Hiram Smith are no more." Gold admitted that he saw 2 wagon loads of men arrive at the Warsaw house that evening, including a man named Wills, who was wounded in the arm or wrist. Between 40 and 60 took supper at Fleming's that night. The final defense witness was 32-year-old Anne Fleming, wife of the proprietor of Fleming's Warsaw house. Lamborn had originally subpoenaed her as a prosecution's witness, but she had failed to appear. Really? So she'll not fight for the prosecution, but she'll fight for the defense. Great. On Tuesday, Browning obtained an attachment to compel her presence in support of the defense. Her husband, Samuel Fleming, who was acting as a deputy in this case, brought her into court on Wednesday morning, and now the reluctant lady was called to the stand. Anne Fleming's direct testimony was brief. She pointed out flatly contradictory of Eliza Graham's. She had no conversation with Sharp on the evening the Smiths were killed. She had no recollection of Sharp or Gregg coming into the hall that evening and calling for a drink of water. She remembered that the number of men came there after dark, took supper, but Captain Grover was not among them. She said she did not hear the men say anything about why they had been doing at Carthage that day or about the killing of the Smiths. She couldn't recall seeing Sharp or Grover that evening. There was a wounded man sitting in the kitchen by the fire that night, but Grover had not come and asked permission for him to sit there. Having achieved the strong conclusion he sought, Browning had the Daniels booklet admitted as evidence so the jury could compare this account with Daniels' testimony on the witness stand. The defense then rested the case. Lamborn said he had no rebutting witnesses. Court was then adjourned until 2 o'clock. Fine. As the crowd reassembled to hear the closing arguments, they may have felt some degree of apprehension, despite the fact that the defense had concluded this 4-day trial with an effective attack on the credibility of the prosecution's 3 key witnesses. Lamborn had a reputation for winning impossible cases. With easy flow of words and superb voice control, he was a matter of courtroom dramatics. One of Judge Young's colleagues on the Supreme Court later said, he knew of no lawyer who was his equal in strength and force of argument. Lamborn could explain the evidence and redirect the thinking of even a hostile jury by his understanding of human nature and his ability to communicate on intimate terms with the fears, prejudices, and aspirations of each juror. A well-known example of Lamborn's mastery of the closing argument occurred in a murder case. So great, we're getting a different one. That bodes well. A well-known example of Lamborn's mastery of the closing argument occurred in a murder case he had prosecuted near Springfield. After the evidence was in, defense counsel E.D. Baker delivered a brilliant and stirring closing argument that seemed to assure acquittal. Sensing that he had no oratorical match for Baker's plea for mercy, especially in the mood this advocate had created, Lamborn seized upon the lateness of the hour and his own supposed indisposition to persuade the court to adjourn until late that evening, when he would deliver his closing remarks. Leaning on the arm of a friend, Lamborn limped to the home of the sheriff to request that the only illumination in the courtroom that night be a candle, positioned so that its rays would strike full in the jury's face. That evening, the jury and a courtroom filled with spectators anxiously watched Lamborn standing before them, stooped and silent, as the single candle cast ghostly shadows on the walls and turned Lamborn's face into a grotesque mask. All thoughts of Baker's eloquent appeal were erased by that gloomy and foreboding presence. A lawyer who witnessed the scene left this description. Quote, every eye was fixed upon him, when, with awful deliberation, in a cold and sepulchral voice, he said, whoso sheddeth the man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. Straightening himself up, and again pausing for half a minute, the shadows around him seeming to grow darker, he again repeated the verse from Holy Writ. Then he was once more silent. Spectres seemed to hover around him. The audience held its breath to hear what he would say next. Rising to his full height with another awful pause in tones as solemn as the grave, he, for a third time, repeated, whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. Raising his arm and pointing his quivering finger toward the jury, he exclaimed with a voice like a trumpet, such is God Almighty's awful decree. Disobey it if you dare. He sat down and said no more, but it was enough. The verdict of guilty had been secured. The lawyer who recorded the event concluded, I have seen in my lifetime some wonderful actors, witnessed some extraordinary scenes on the stage, but never have I seen anything equal to that night's work in that humble courtroom. The courtroom crowd in Carthage was doubtless eager to see what an advocate of Lamborn's ability could do in this difficult situation. As Lamborn stood to begin his argument, he must have known that only the greatest good fortune could save his case against any of these defendants. The crowd may have expected some courtroom dramatics, but they can hardly have been prepared for the extraordinary maneuvers Lamborn employed. Walking painfully with the assistance of his cane, the tall but crippled prosecutor skillfully used his physical disability to underline his helplessness in being arrayed against 4 distinguished lawyers for the defense. He called upon the jury's sympathy for his plight as a stranger who had to conduct his case alone. in the face of such odds. Then, moving with sudden speed and boldness, Lamborn stunned his listeners with a series of daring concessions that altered the entire posture of the prosecution's case. No doubt, Daniels was in Carthage when Smith was killed, Lamborn began, and no doubt the substantial features of his evidence are true. But he has made statements which ought to impeach his evidence before any court. His book, Lamborn conceded, was ridiculous, a tissue of falsehoods from beginning to end. Therefore, it's impossible to rely on his testimony. I intend to be fair and candid, Lamborn declared, and therefore exclude Davis's evidence from the consideration of the jury. Having made this concession, Lamborn went still further, dismissing Brackenbury's testimony in similar fashion. Brackenbury was drunk, is a loafer, and perjured himself before the grand jury. I'm satisfied that his evidence can be successfully impeached, and therefore withdraw it from the jury. Turning to Eliza Jane Graham, his other major witness, Lamborn declared that he was sincerely of the opinion that she spoke the truth, and that the other witnesses were mistaken. But she's contradicted, and I therefore give her up. In a few moments' time, Lamborn had completely surrendered on the issue of the credibility of his three major witnesses. But there were more concessions to come. In short order, Lamborn effectively dropped the charges against Davis and Grover. I have no doubt in my own mind, not a particle, that Davis cooperated in the murder, but there is no legal evidence to convict him, nor is there evidence to convict Captain Grover, though I verily believe that he was at the jail with his gun. Suddenly, after this bewildering change of direction, the prosecution's case stood without the testimony of three key witnesses, Daniels, Brackenbury, and Graham, and consisted of charges against only three persons, Mark Aldrich, Thomas C. Sharp, and Levi Williams, as to whom the remaining evidence was diffuse and circumstantial. What could have motivated Lamborn to make such unexpected and devastating concessions? There's at least three possibilities: logic, fear, and favor. I cannot wait for the defense of what he just did, because frankly, I am not happy. The prosecutor's actions can be explained, at least in part on logical grounds, as an attempt to win the jury's respect for his impartiality and encourage their reliance on other prosecution witnesses by candidly disavowing the questionable ones. This explanation could account for Lamborn's dropping the case against Davis, which was entirely insufficient. The case against Grover, on the other hand, was strong if prosecution witnesses were believed, since they had testified that he had led the mob to Carthage, that he was the only defendant seen at the jail with a gun, and he had bragged about how he had killed Joseph Smith, but his testimony was almost solely that of Daniels. Brackenbury and Graham also, Lamborn's disavowal of these three witnesses, left the evidence against Grover on the same insufficient basis as that Davis. Thus, if Lamborn's strategy was to demonstrate his impartiality, and if that demonstration required disavowal of the controverted prosecution testimony, then Grover's case was just as appropriate for dismissal as Davis's. But the strategy of disavowing the testimony of the controverted witnesses was highly questionable as a basis for repudiating Eliza Graham. Unlike Daniels and Brackenbury, she had not been impeached. True, several defense witnesses had contradicted her testimony in important respects, but that common phenomenon of courtroom experience, witnesses with different perceptions or recollections, was hardly a sufficient justification to withdraw her testimony. More likely, she was disavowed because once Daniels and Brackenbury were excluded, she was the only one remaining. She was the only remaining Mormon witness. By excluding her, Lamborn would give up some usable evidence, but he might counter the anti-Mormon feelings of the jury, making certain that his concessions would be seen in that light. Lamborn later reminded the jury that he had not asked that a Mormon should be put upon the jury, and emphasized that we use no Mormon witnesses. The correspondent of the anti-Mormon Burlington Hawkeye gave Lamborn the credit for candor and fairness, and he may have been seeking by these concessions. Writing from Carthage on the day of Lamborn's speech, he said, "The evidence for the prosecution has been very positive and to the point nominally, but never were witnesses more thoroughly ridiculed in the cross-examination. So completely and effectually were they discredited, even from their own mouths, that the prosecution attorney felt himself obliged to declare three of them perjured scoundrels." Yeah, I love it when the prosecution makes it so that He ridicules his own witnesses. This is great. This is great. Yeah, he's doing a great job here. Wonderful, wonderful. Yeah, go Lamborn. Second, the prosecutor's concessions might have been at least partly attributable to fear that the armed and hostile courtroom crowd would take reprisals against him if he appeared to press the unpopular case with too much diligence. Yeah, they're working out of practicality again. Here it is, rearing its ugly head once more. Lamborn could not have forgotten how angry spectators in Springfield had nearly lynched him for his excessive zeal in prosecuting the Taylor case. He nearly got 2 people killed over a live man. So far as the current trial was concerned, Governor Ford later reported to the legislature that Lamborn prosecuted this case at the constant peril of his life. His fee for the entire prosecution was only $100. How much risk could a man be expected to run for that amount of money? Of even less credit to Lamborn is the third possibility, that his concessions might have been motivated by corrupt favors or the hope of such favors from the defense. In most prosecutions, such concessions, even by a prosecutor of Lamborn's assertiveness and partisanship, could be seen as a tactical moves that raised no ugly doubts of impropriety, which we know he had problems with early in his career and talked about here and there throughout. But Lamborn's background does not allow one to ignore the possibility of corruption. Usher Linder, one of Lamborn's contemporaries at the Illinois bar, charged in a posthumous biographical note that Lamborn was wholly destitute of principle and shamelessly took bribes from criminals prosecuted during his administration. Writing of a period just a few years before the Carthage trial, Linder says, "I know myself of having dismissed 40 or 50 indictments at the Shelbyville court and openly displayed the money he had received from the defendants. He showed me a roll of bills amounting to $600 or $800, which he acknowledged he had received from them, the fruits of this maladministration of his office as Attorney General of the state." Whatever motivated Lamborn's startling concessions, he pressed forward with his argument that Aldrich, Sharp, and Williams should be convicted. Upon the remaining testimony, he spoke for over an hour. The evidence was only circumstantial, Lamborn acknowledged, but circumstantial evidence could be the most conclusive. Since this was a case of conspiracy, Lamborn reminded the jury that the prosecution was not bound to prove that these men struck the blow or were at the jail. It was sufficient that they were part of the plot to kill the Smiths, that they had committed acts in aid of that plan. Speaking of the circumstantial evidence against these 3 defendants, Lamborn told the jury that these men who murdered Joseph Smith could easily be traced from the railroad shanties to Carthage back to Warsaw. Sharp was in Carthage on the morning of the days of the murder, opposing the disbanding of the troops and fanning the flame of rebellion and mobocracy. When the governor discharged the troops, Sharp inflamed them at the railroad. Another point of evidence against Sharp, which Lamborn made with great emphasis, was the fact that Sharp did not inform the Carthage Greys that a mob was coming. Finally, Sharp carried the news to Warsaw. So far as is revealed by the only source on his argument, Lamborn said very little about the evidence against Williams and Aldrich. Colonel Williams knew that volunteers were called for Carthage. He saw it all done and sanctioned and approved it. As for Aldrich, he was at the railroad. Lamborn concluded his argument by entreating the jury not to say they have no legal evidence. It is true that these defendants put others forward, but these men were the soul of that movement. That was all. A master of the dramatic gestures and the surprise tactical thrust, Lamborn was less expert at marshaling scraps of evidence from the mouths of nearly a score of witnesses and bringing them to focus on the guilty involvement of the defendants. Yet, the evidence Lamborn had referred to in his argument was predominantly the evidence given on the last day of the trial, on cross-examination of defense witnesses. This was the evidence most easily recalled, but it was only a fraction of the evidence available against the remaining 3 defendants. There is no record of his mentioning a multitude of other undisputed incriminatory facts proved from the witnesses other than Daniels, Brackenbury, and Graham. Aldrich had attempted a speech, and Sharp had made full speech at the railroad shanties. Sorry. All right, what bug is this? It's another beetle. Sorry. Down here I have some beetles that cross the floor. I had to get rid of it. All right. So there's no record of mentioning a multitude of other undisputed incriminatory facts provided from other witnesses other than Daniels, Brackenbury, and Graham. Aldrich had attempted a speech, and Sharp had made full speech at the railroad shanties. Sharp had damned the Mormons and their power in the county. Aldrich had made a call for volunteers to go to Carthage. Levi Williams had also said something about volunteers. Someone spoke about blowing... Oh, now the cats are playing with it. Sorry, just a second here. Oh, whatever. I'll have to find it later, I suppose. Sorry for the interruption. I really am. I apologize. I'd like, if you'll permit me, I'll start the paragraph over. That was all. A master of the dramatic gesture and the surprise tactical thrust, Lamborn was less expert at marshalling scraps of evidence from the mouths of nearly a score of witnesses and bringing them to focus on the guilty involvement in the defendants. The evidence Lamborn had referred to in his argument was predominantly the evidence given on the last day of the trial, on cross-examination of the defense witnesses. This was the evidence most easily recalled, but it was only a fraction of the evidence available against the remaining 3 defendants. There is no record of his mentioning a multitude of other undisputed incriminatory facts proved from witnesses other than Daniels, Brackenbury, and Graham. Aldrich had attempted a speech, and Sharp had made a full speech at the railroad shanties. Sharp had damned the Mormons and their power in the county. Aldrich had made a call for volunteers to go to Carthage. Levi Williams had also said something about volunteers. Someone spoke about blowing the jail to hell. Davis had indicated his knowledge of what was being proposed when he withdrew from the group because he said he'd be damned if he'd kill men in jail. After these statements of a crowd of men, including Aldrich, Sharp, and Williams, he had started for Carthage. These 3, who were on horseback, arrived in Carthage before 3 o'clock. The jail guard fired into the mob, but no one was hit. Carthage Greys called out when shooting began at the jail, marched to the jail so slowly that the mob had departed toward the west before they arrived. The guard made no attempt at pursuit. Just before sundown, Sharp rode into Warsaw, which had been almost deserted during that day, and announced that the Smiths were dead. That night, between 9 and midnight, a group of 40 to 60 men, including 2 who were wounded, arrived in Warsaw and took supper at the Warsaw House. This additional evidence may have been insufficient to convict any of the 3 defendants. Nevertheless, it is strange that Lamborn, whose voluntary exclusion of the testimony of Daniels, Brackenbury, and Graham can only be justified as a tactical maneuver intended to reinforce the strength of his remaining evidence, so conspicuously failed to marshal and utilize that remaining evidence. Perhaps the prosecutor deliberately pulled his punches. Governor Ford had sent him to vindicate the honor of the state. That objective could be served by a prosecution that resulted in acquittal. Conviction would surely heighten domestic strife and perhaps cause a civil war. To many, the prosecutor's effort appeared satisfactory. The correspondent of the Missouri Republican said that Lamborn managed the prosecution with much ability and may have convinced all parties, especially the Mormons, that everything was done that it was possible to accomplish by a faithful and indefatigable discharge of his duty to the state. Oh, I'm so glad they're telling us that, according to what the Missouri Republican would say. Although acquittal seemed the most likely result following Lamborn's argument, the defense counsel could not take any chances, since death by hanging was the single mandatory penalty for crime of murder. The defendants' lives were in jeopardy, and no effort could be spared in their defense. 3 lawyers spoke for the defense. Their speeches concluded, 3 of them, concluded the day on Wednesday and occupied most of Thursday as well. Calvin A. Warren spoke first. The Burlington Hawkeye reporter observed that Warren was an able and effective speaker, and biting sarcasm and keen wit had every chance for display. Great. A correspondent for the Missouri Republican, writing 2 days later, was somewhat more reserved in his praise. After heaping compliments on the 2 other defense counsel, Skinner, speech marked with much ability, and Browning, able, the correspondent withheld praise and merely observed that Mr. Warren also made a speech in a vein and manner which is peculiarly his own. A Mormon source termed Warren's speech the most inflammatory of the trial. Warren's dominant theme was an appeal to anti-Mormon prejudice, by attacking the dead Mormon leaders and by suggesting that whoever killed them had acted in the best interest and with approval of the non-Mormon citizens of the county. He sounded his dominant theme at the outset. If these men are guilty, then are every man, woman, and child in the county guilty. The same evidence that has been given against the defendants could have been given against hundreds of others. Time after time, Warren reminded the jury that the defendants were strongly identified with the predominant interest of the county. These men were the whole county enraged at the audacity and conduct of the Smiths. They dared complain of their grievances, and because the Smiths were murdered on the same day, you're asked to believe that they did it. Next, Warren accused Lamborn. These men complained about everything the Smiths did. Well, you complained too, so you're just as guilty as they are. Oh, jeez. Next, Warren accused Lamborn of trying to prejudice the jury by suggesting that it is necessary that there should be a conviction in order to restore peace to the county and to quiet the excitement, or that a curse would rest upon the county until a victim should be offered up. Almer and Wheat, Warren's law partner, who took notes on the address, omits any details of how Warren enlarged on this subject, only observing caustically. Then Warren gets religious and talks about the Bible, truth, God, etc., etc. After quoting a sentiment from Jefferson about oppression caused by public excitement, Warren gave the jury this characterization of the ruling legal principle in the prosecution for murder. What is the law? Is it based upon public opinion and is worth nothing without it? Here, Warren was apparently attempting to imply that the law did not require the jury to punish a murderer where the public approved of the killing. Let me read that sentence again. Here, Warren was apparently attempting to imply that the law did not require the jury to punish a murderer where the public approved of the killing. In commenting on the evidence against the individual defendants, Warren seized upon Lamborn's dismissal of charges against Davis and Grover, and urged that the evidence against the other 3 was no stronger. You can't let these men off without letting all off, he cried. All are equally guilty. The transaction is over, and whatever was going on, one of these defendants is as guilty as the rest. Warren then concluded by returning to his dominant theme. If you believe that these defendants are not as clear of the murder of the Smiths as all the rest of the people in the county, hang them. If you do hang them, it will be for not participating in this matter, for all the evidence except the 3 Mormons show that they had nothing to do with it. Once again, Warren had told the jury that the defendants were simply accused of doing what the old citizens of the county wanted. On that note, Warren's 90-minute argument concluded. and the court adjourned until Thursday. On Wednesday evening, a person with the initials JTM wrote a letter to the Burlington Hawkeye, which speaks derisively of the whole affair. Quote, "The jury will probably retire tomorrow night and make up their verdict, but there seems to be no doubt of the result. It's generally thought that the jury will not be out half an hour, and that a verdict of not guilty will be rendered for each defendant. Two of them, Davis and Grover, are virtually clear, as the prosecution admit that there's no evidence against them. The whole appears more like a farce than the solemn trial, involving the lives of 5 men. The defendants are at large without bail, most unconcerned men of any engaged in the proceeding. This fact itself shows plainly what the general opinion is as to their guilt, and how certain is their acquittal." On Thursday morning, May 29th, the jury heard young Onias C. Skinner in the major forensic effort for the defense. This speech was to have been given by the senior defense counsel, Colonel Williams A. Richardson, but Skinner told the jury that Richardson was ill, and it developed upon him to make the argument. Skinner commenced by alerting the jury to Lamborn's remarkably shrewd purpose in excluding the evidence of the 3 witnesses and conceding the acquittal of Davis and Grover. The object and design of all this anxiety on his part is to impress and deceive the jury, to throw the case into a new channel, and having obtained your ill-placed confidence, to triumph in prosecution by, in his concluding speech, ringing and weaving with the slight circumstances against the defts, the testimony of his abandoned and perjured witnesses. Why did he do this? I do not wish to charge the gentleman with corruption or improper motives, Skinner declared. Quote, "I'm willing to attribute all these efforts at conviction through management, trick, and chicanery to his inordinate ambition, his pride of success, and love of fame. He comes here with a reputation for criminal prosecution unparalleled in our county, and perhaps he would not have had a rival among the great champions of the state trials in any other county, and such has been his success throughout this state that it seems to be understood that when Lamborn prosecutes, conviction follows, guilty or innocent. It is this enviable reputation, the glory of his highest ambition, he desires to sustain by conviction of these defendants." Skinner then referred to the 3 Mormon witnesses, Daniels, Brackenbury, and Graham, as witnesses legally and conclusively impeached, witnesses that no honest Mormon would for a moment credit. Witnesses whose absurd and stultifying statements, while on the stand, sent successive sensations of mirth and disgust through this audience and shocked the jury and every spectator at their utter depravity and degradation. These Mormon witnesses. Oh. Skinner was obviously an advocate of considerable skill who concentrated his fire upon the prosecution's case, not upon the anti-Mormon or anti-Smith prejudices of the jury. I don't know, really? When this is his quote was, "Witnesses legally and conclusively impeached, witnesses that no honest Mormon would for a moment credit, witnesses who observed." So yeah, he's focusing on how absurd the witnesses are. Really? To me, it seems like he's bringing up the fact that they're Mormon. Whatever. No, he's not really focusing on that. Really. When you're speaking with an anti-Mormon crowd, and you say that their witnesses are so discredited that even the Mormons would reject their witnesses. These guys are so bad that even those Mormons would discredit them. Oh. Skinner next analyzed and ridiculed the testimony of the remaining witnesses piece by piece. It was true that Sharp rode out and met the Warsaw troops at the railroad shanties, but he merely delivered the news about the governor disbanding them. In his speech, he just informed his friends, including William and Aldrich, of what had taken place in Carthage, and of his conversation in trying to persuade the governor to march to Nauvoo. Considering the circumstances, there was nothing sinister about Sharp's speech. Hundreds of others had also recited grievances against the Smiths. Eli Walker's lack of recollection that Sharp made a speech suggests that his so-called speech was nothing more than a private conversation with those around him. The same was true of Aldrich and Williams. In view of the anxious condition then existing in the county, no one could go from place to place without being compelled to make at least a small speech to convey what information he possessed. That was all the evidence against Aldrich Skinner contended. Now Lamborn asks you to convict a man for using language that anybody used. Peyton said Williams was at the shanties, but he did not have him say one word, and he did not even know whether Williams was there. At the time, the volunteers stepped out. If Williams had been trying to raise mobs and urge them to murder, wouldn't Peyton have known it? Before you can find any of the defendants guilty, Skinner told the jury, you must believe from the evidence that a conspiracy was found and entered into to kill the Smiths. Was there a common design? Skinner then proceeded to challenge the idea of a conspiracy by characterizing the actions at the railroad shanties as just the behavior one would expect when a military force was disbanded suddenly with the removal of military discipline and vigor. Some were saying they would go to Carthage to see why they were disbanded. Some were cursing the governor, some were abusing the Mormons as the cause of their miseries. Some were speaking of returning to Warsaw for dinner, and some were shooting at Marks. Where was the common design? In order to do justice to this case, Skinner told the jury, you should have a clear understanding of circumstantial evidence. Before the jury found the defendants guilty, it would have to be clearly proved that there was a conspiracy to kill the Smiths, that this conspiracy did kill them, that these defendants were part of the conspiracy and planned, aided, and abetted in its design. Skinner contended that the evidence was insufficient on all these points. The Smiths could have been killed by men with whom the defendants had no connection. Skinner argued, since the area was full of men who had threatened Joseph Smith's life, many of whom had just been discharged in or around Carthage with weapons in their possession, couldn't the murder have been committed by some of these men? Skinner asked. He reminded the jury that witnesses Hobart, Worrell, and Dixon, all well acquainted with the residents of the county, were at the jail when the act was committed, and they did not know of any of the men, although they were not disguised. If the mob that numbered from 60 to 150 had been from Warsaw, wouldn't some of the witnesses have known some of them? Yeah, good question. I wonder why. The inference from this fact, Skinner concluded, is that the mob was not composed of Warsaw men, but of strangers. Skinner concluded his argument with the charge that the whole case against the defendants amounted to nothing more than the fact that certain men were thirsting for blood and desired to have some victim offered up upon the gallows to appease the name of the prophet, an idol of a powerful faction. Skinner had spoken for 3 hours. It was almost noon. Buoyed by the effectiveness of their counsel's arguments, the defendants and their friends must have been relaxed and confident of the outcome. A newspaperman described the trial at this point as orderly and decorous, and observed that the interest in the case, though deep, has not manifested itself in any undue form. The final spokesman for the defense was Orville H. Browning. His argument, which began immediately after lunch, was thoroughly professional attack upon the prosecution and its case. It began in a manner familiar to every trial lawyer. He sympathized with the jury that had been close confined for many days on its tedious task, promised not to detain you longer than necessary demands, and spoke in reverent terms of the peculiar responsibility of a jury when the matter at stake is not property or liberty, but life. Proceeding to the substance of his argument, Browning first ridiculed Lamborn's statement that he came here as a stranger without sympathy. Who brought him among strangers? Browning asked. The people of Hancock did not send for him. He thrust himself among them. Then Browning complained about the efforts of certain newspapers to arouse public prejudice against the defendants, about a crusade commenced against the defendants, based on witnesses so foul and corrupt that even Mr. Lamborn withdraws their testimony from your consideration and tells you they are not worthy of belief. I have to remind myself, Browning is just doing his job. He's just doing his job. He's just doing his job. Could you defend somebody that you knew was so guilty? But that's the point, is not to believe that they're guilty. It's just to defend them. Browning skillfully turned Lamborn's concession on Davis and Grover to the defendant's advantage by declaring that it destroys his case against the other defendants, because there is as much evidence against Grover as against Williams, as much as against Davis, as against Aldrich, and as much against either as against Sharp. Really, the guy whose newspaper is literally calling for the murder of people. Yeah, it's all the same. If the evidence given by the other witnesses was insufficient to convict the defendants, as the prosecutor had said, then Browning asserted he has been at an immense amount of labor for nothing. If he really believed it would not have put himself to the trouble of bringing these perjured witnesses. In one of his few appeals to popular prejudice, Browning shrewdly played upon the jurymen's fears of civil war in the county. Mr. Lamborn says convict Williams, Aldrich, and Sharp, and peace will be restored. I say acquit these men and peace will be restored, but let a sentence of conviction be attempted to be carried into execution, and the gallows will be a beacon around which to rally a more terrible armed force than you or I have ever seen. It would be the commencement of a more bloody and terrible war than you or I want to see. Yeah, convict these men and watch war commence. Yeah, that's a great defense, Who cares about whether the evidence is real or not? No, just remember, only civil wars in the balance, as we've seen the whole time. At the outset, Browning had stated his intention to confine myself to what Mr. Lamborn wishes us to be confined. Anticipating a strong jury bias against the Mormon witnesses, however, Browning soon told the jury that he proposed speaking a few words about the witnesses whose testimony Mr. Lamborn has thrown out. He then devoted a major part of his argument to an attack on the three fortified witnesses. No human mind can doubt, but Daniels had been bribed. He cares for neither God nor man. He was in the market, and no man can doubt, but some hell-defying scoundrels in Nauvoo have bought him up. And I do not charge the Mormons as a body. Oh, no. I'll just mention it here. Browning reminded the jury that Daniels had fared sumptuously ever since joining the Mormon Church. Though he neither toils nor spins, yet he is a cooper by trade. Brackenbury had also found it convenient to go to Nauvoo about the same time, and he too fares sumptuously. He's fed by an unseen hand. He follows no business for a living, is, to use his own language professionally, a loafer, and has followed loafing ever since he went to Nauvoo. But I'm not criticizing the Mormons there. After criticizing Eliza Graham for inconsistencies between her testimony and that of the other witnesses, challenging her with reluctance, he said, because she belongs to the gentler sex. Browning concluded this point by reading from a legal treatise to the effect that if there is reason to suppose that a witness's lying is the result of a deliberate encouragement by one of the parties, this affords a reasonable ground in a doubtful case for suspecting the testimony of other witnesses offered by the same party. But he's not saying it's the Mormons. Remember, he's not saying that. Not. No. Speaking candidly to a jury partial to his cause, Browning said, although the defendants be guilty, yet all you can look at for the purpose of determining that question is the evidence, and unless you're satisfied of the guilt of the defendants beyond any reasonable doubt, you must acquit them. reviewing and dismissing as non-incriminatory all of the remaining evidence against the defendants, Browning said scornfully, "Why, you would not hang a dog on such evidence." In his final moments, Browning reminded the jury of the dire consequences that would follow from a conviction. "Find a verdict, whatever it may be," he said, "but do not hang. That would be the greatest calamity that could befall your county or these defendants. Just remember, if you convict them, there's going to be civil war." By the time, on a tradition, the prosecutor had the last word. Lamborn's second and concluding argument may have been given Thursday afternoon following Browning, but it was probably delivered Friday morning. Its content is unknown. The various trial records and newspapers are silent on the subject. Judge Young gave the jury their instruction just before noon on Friday. In his History of Illinois, Governor Ford states that the trial judges in early Illinois courts were adverse to deciding questions of law if they could possibly avoid it, and they never gave instructions to a jury unless expressly called for, and then only upon the points of law raised by counsel in asking for them. Judges never commented upon the evidence or undertook to show the jury what inferences or presumptions might be drawn from it. Judge Young was an experienced and able jurist. It was doubtless through custom and expectation of the lawyers, rather than through any lack of judicial ability, that his jury instructions in this case were very brief. Most of Judge Young's instructions mirrored the points of the law already averted to in the closing arguments of the defense counsel. All were clearly instructions tailored for the benefit of the defense. There's nothing out of the ordinary about the content of the instructions that were given, but the absence of instructions favorable to the prosecution is striking. Is it really? Is it? Lamborn apparently made no requests for instructions. There were no instructions on the inferences that could properly be drawn from the evidence, despite the fact that the prosecution's case depended upon the application of the complicated legal theory of conspiracy. There were no instructions on defendants' legal responsibility for the acts of others pursuant to their common design. The total absence of jury instructions to explain their theory of the prosecution's case is among the most obvious and most serious of the prosecution's mistake at the trial. If that's the case, then I ask myself, was it a mistake? Judge Young finished instructing the jury at 11:30 on Friday, May 30th, 1845, just 6 court days after the jury had begun hearing testimony. Court then adjourned for lunch, and the jury filed out of the room set aside for their use. No one was apprehensive about their verdict, and little excitement accompanied its delivery. The trial began, with fears and preparations for armed conflict was drawing quietly to an end. On the second day of the trial, during the choosing of the jury, the newspapermen had written of a bad state of things where everybody almost attending the court comes armed to the teeth. 2 weeks later, after the trial was concluded, same paper and probably the same correspondent published the following euphoric description of the event. Quote, "During the whole progress of this trial, Judge Young has presided with a dignity and impartiality which has commended him to all parties in the county, and which did more toward tranquilizing any acerbity of the feeling which may have been entertained by any portion of them. The whole trial passed off quietly, nothing occurring during its progress to reflect upon the character of the citizens of the county, and upon the announcement of the verdict, no feeling either upon one side or the other was manifested." At 2 o'clock, when the court reconvened, the jury reported that they had reached their verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendants not guilty, as charged in the indictment." There you go. Yeah. Figured. The trial of the indicted assassins of Joseph Smith had ended in acquittal. It is impossible to determine the extent to which the jury's verdict was attributable to the weakness of the prosecution's case, in view of Lamborn's concessions, or the jury's unwillingness to convict, whatever the evidence. It was probably a combination of both. Defense counsel argued the weakness of the evidence, but they also urged acquittal because of conviction would bring civil war, and because the community, in fact, approved of the crime. Aside from the Mormons, the people of Hancock were generally satisfied with the verdict. John Hay declared, "There was not a man on the jury, in the court, or in the county that did not know the defendants had done the murder. But it was not proven, and the verdict of not guilty was right in law." Listen to that. It's the same thing that I've been saying the whole time. John Hay declared, "There was not a man on the jury, in the court, or in the county that did not know the defendants had done the murder." Everybody knew. But it was not proven, and the verdict of not guilty was right in the law. Everybody knew it. Everybody knew what happened, but it wasn't proven. And so, since it just couldn't be proved in the court of law, because, a jury gets quashed, the entire rights of a section of people is destroyed. The people who are on the bench as jurists were probably anti-Mormons as well. Don't worry. You shouldn't convict because there's going to be civil war. Not because you have to worry about the truth, because people who came armed to the teeth to ensure that these people weren't convicted, who came armed, worry about them. Worry about the Civil War. Don't worry, the prosecution, who takes bribes and other things like that throughout his law career, he gave a stirring speech that he was really doing it for his conscience and the applause of heaven. Continuing the quote of John Hay, "And you cannot find in this generation an original inhabitant of Hancock County who will not stoutly sustain that verdict. It's okay because we all wanted them murdered. It's okay. We all wanted them murdered, so it's just fine." The Nauvoo neighbor carried a brief notice of the acquittal, observing that if the jury had convicted, it would have been a violation of all the rules of the world in all martyr cases before. That's true, right? Anyone who's martyred before, it's okay. It's okay. Let the murderers get away with it. Because, well, otherwise, why wouldn't it be martyrdom? The Mormon paper referred the case to God for a righteous judgment. It's the only way you're going to get anything. And they knew it. They knew it from the outset. Brigham Young recorded in his journal that the defendants had been acquitted, as we had anticipated. Yeah. But the jury's verdict still stung the Mormon leaders. 3 times during the week following the trial, the 12 met and prayed that justice might overtake the murderers of Joseph and Hyrum, that Judge Young might be afflicted for joining hands with the murderers, and that the judge and jury may be afflicted. Thoughtful members in all parties rejoiced that the trial had concluded without bloodshed. Yeah, it's great when everything is literally stacked in the way that you want as a county. Or other provocation for civil war. If some were we are so grateful that the judge eliminated the citizenship of an entire group of people that in short order, and after, couple months, they'd be able to blast cannons at the sick and weak that hadn't evacuated Nauvoo. But that's okay, It doesn't matter. If you harass a Mormon in some way, it's okay. Just remember, Judge Young lets you know that you can just say, don't worry about the jury panelists. They can't be Mormons. Yeah. Really helps. Really helps when armed men come, that witnesses don't want to come because of the threat of violence. That armed men come to ensure that the witnesses that are there and everyone who is there just suddenly has really bad memory. And those who are willing to testify, well, we can always find people who contradict them. But don't worry, we got the jurists we want, because Mormons aren't people anymore, so they can't be on that jury. Oh, by the way, it's because the murderers said they don't trust them. Because, I don't know, the people that they murdered, well, they're not people, so why have them serve in their capacity as duly elected official? Why have them serve on the jury, which they should have the right to do? No. The murderers could indict these people, even though there was no testimony heard against them, even though there was nothing that showed that they shouldn't be on there. But no. The murderers who conspired to kill Joseph Smith, they just said so. By the way, they were never arrested. They never were held at all, even though they were part of the murdering group. Oh, yeah. Oh, that allowed those people who were wounded, who have physical evidence against them, to run? Huh. Funny that. Yeah. Funny that. Sorry, let me reread the last paragraph here. Thoughtful members and all parties rejoiced that the trial had concluded without bloodshed or other provocation for civil war. That may be true. If some were doubtful that the trial had achieved justice, most were satisfied that it at least preserved peace. For the state, the defendants, even the Mormons, the effect of the trial was just as Josiah Lamborn had predicted when he told the jury in his closing argument that this trial will tranquilize the public mind. See, they had done their best. Really? I'm sorry. I find it very repugnant overall. There's actually a lot of really big footnotes in here. Stuff about what the defense asked the judge to say. Next chapter is A Way to a Land of Peace. After which, there's The People Reign, which is very short, a short afterword, and Religious Persuasion of the Jurors, which is just less than a page, and some biographical notes. I'll see if the biographical notes are worth anything, but so two more chapters, and then we can start on the ministry of Christ. I'm not surprised. I'm really not surprised. I'm very unfortunately disappointed at the conduct of everything here. But of course, I think this comes down to what do you do? Again, I think the theme of my questioning at the end of every chapter has always been pragmatism, practicality, what am I saying? Yeah, practicality or principle. As a matter of practicality, no one in the county, other than the people who were being murdered and killed and disparaged and destroyed, wanted justice. No, everyone wanted to kill the Mormons. Oh, except the Mormons. And even though they were a majority of the people there and had duly elected people, doesn't matter. All the rest of the people were literally up in arms and ready to take lives, as we saw by Joseph and Hiram's death. Witnesses didn't want to come forward because of the exact same thing happening to them, especially if they were Mormon, and especially if they were Mormon leaders. So even though there were people that were there, and they couldn't, I just question even Governor Ford himself at this point. Like, what was his thing in all this? He talked with guards just before he left for Nauvoo. The guards themselves fired blank cartridges. They're just... Everybody knew. Even people in the county all said, oh, we all knew that they were a part of it. We all knew that they did this. But just because, we couldn't get it proved in a court, well, that's just fine. Gee, that's just fine. How heinous is that? History is really terrible and messy because I continually reflect. Do you sit there and go to your death knowing that you were trying to do what was right based on principle instead of practicality. When you had an entire church to lead, would you go and try to actually get the murderers convicted when you also knew that you would likely be killed? It would likely not change the outcome because of the ruling of the judge. That the people, if they were convicted, let's say people were principled enough to not just excuse them, because now they had a panel of jurists that are against them, that would mean that they'd be acquitted anyway. Would it change? It's likely that it wouldn't change the outcome. So you can be killed. It likely wouldn't change the outcome. And even if it did change the outcome and they were convicted, would they actually get to the gallows, or would they just be set free? And even if they did get to the gallows, would it not cause a civil war? You have such an array of things that are against the proper prosecution of this. Practicality versus principle. It's an ugly thing. Very ugly thing. I really wish I could say that I would do things in a principled way. But when you seriously look at it, what would you do? You had a church to lead, you had people to save from these mobs, organizing and trying to get them to where they need to be so that they can have peace. It's straight up political and religious bigotry. They all move to a place, they gain the votes, suddenly they're no longer liked. And them and their strange religion and all that stuff that everyone says that's bad about them. Well, it's all bad. It must all be true because I don't like them. Why don't you like them? Well, because I was told to not like them. Well, why were you not told to like them? Well, because people in political power didn't like it. I'm not surprised. I knew it. Yet at the same time, I still have to sit here and go, I want to say I would love to do things in principle, by principle. At the same time, what? Should I make an excuse that the principle in this matter would be to run away and fight another day? You kind of knew this was going to happen anyway, and so you have to leave it up to God's judgment, so get the members of the church out of here. Do like the presidents of the church. Yeah, we wish you the best of luck on that trial, because we know that we've been through this rodeo before, except even worse in Missouri. But, oh well. What can I take from this that's good? That maybe we should rely on God in a lot of things. When justice is not done, when as people have admitted in paper and ink that everybody knew that they had conspired, and that everybody knew what had happened and who was there and who killed, but they would do everything in their power to make sure that they weren't committed. You have to rely on God for justice, and you have to rely on God for hope. Should you go and try, despite the impracticality of it, to do things based on principle? I still believe in most cases, yes. But sometimes I think you have to rely on the wisdom and prudence of God to direct your path. And just do what is right. Let the consequence follow. So may God be with you. May His Spirit guide you in whatever trials you go through. And may it be a fair trial. And if it's not fair trial, if the world and all its horrors are arrayed against you, I hope that you will find peace in God's words and in his direction. We'll be seeing you.